All right, so we're getting all masked up here, and I'll tell you what I'm doing. But first, let me go back to some housekeeping. I forgot to tell you guys, I did some other testing off camera. You can see this little stack of mixing cups that I've got going here. I'm trying to keep everything pure. I tried some different ratios last night, and working with spraying really small because, again, for aircraft guys, a lot of people who are doing black basing want to know how well this stuff works for that application, and that comes down to spraying small. Now, I'll be the first one to tell you that my Iwata Neo with a 0.35 millimeter needle in it is not the best thing for spraying small, but because it's a trigger airbrush, and with my dexterity issues, that's my best choice. I have a Sotar, and I'm going to try some of this paint in the Sotar with its 0.15 millimeter needle and see how that works out. But I wanted to see how far I could push it with my standard tool, and this is kind of what I got. And you can see that I was able to do some pretty variable patterns. Certainly, you can spray smaller. I mean, look, if you're using an Iwata Micron, you can spray, down to the size of a pencil line. And that's fantastic if you feel the need to do that. Some guys, when they do their pre-shading with the black basing method, that's what they want. I personally don't care that much. In fact, I do a lot of my black basing with a sponge, so it doesn't really matter. And I do that partly because I don't spray that small as well as other people do with better equipment and better control. But I also don't want to spend all damn day doing it. And more importantly, I like the randomized effect that a sponge pattern gives. This is, for me, this is plenty good enough. And it all just kind of depends. I mean, look, in terms of a marble coat, there's as many styles of marble coat as there is styles of cheese. It's up to you, whatever you think is going to work best for the look you want. And I tried to show some sort of different, styles with this little test, and I thought it worked pretty well. Now, the ratios I tried. On John's recommendation, I tried spraying the paint straight with just poly, and I did a bunch of that. Let's see. I think it's on the back side of this workpiece. Yeah, a bunch of that here was sprayed straight with poly. And it did fine. I was able to spray pretty tight. I mean, you can see there's some really small lines in there and, a little bit of spidering, but that's as much down to my lack of control as anything. I mean, I was able to spray just the tops of these little square things and do pretty well. But I did find with the poly that when I went with the straight poly, that I had some clogging. I live in a very low humidity environment, and especially right now in the dead of winter with the heater running all the time, it's literally like 19% humidity in my house. So that contributes without a doubt. And so I did have a little bit of tip dry. Not a big deal, just take a Q-tip that is wet with some thinners on it and just real quickly clean that off and continue working. I will say that I had far less tip dry than I've ever had with any other paint of this type under those circumstances. But to try and make it even better, I went to a ratio that had 10% thinner and 25 or 30% poly. And that worked okay. That's what I did all of this with. And you can see that it's not bad. I mean, there's some overspray splatter in there. I mean, you can see that. So it's not as tight as I think I would get under the exact same conditions out of a lacquer like Mr. Paint. But again, that's a very tall hill to climb for an acrylic. And I would never, like I said before, expect to be able to get that kind of a result out of anything that was water-based. So anyway, back to the masking. I'm doing a little bit of multimedia masking here, and that's on top of the hairspray. You can see that now I've got a sort of a a light sheen of hairspray on there. I sprayed one layer, and that was even pretty heavy. I went ahead and did it with my can of Tresemme because that's kind of the baseline, even though I have found with acrylics like Tamiya that I am better off to apply the hairspray with an airbrush, because out of the can it just goes on so heavy and the paint ends up just flying off way easier than I want it to. But I want to keep things simple, and so for this test I put it on there with the spray can using Mike Rinaldi's method of arm's length away and just a quick blast. But I did get a pretty heavy layer there, so we'll see how that all works out. Now the masking, I wanted to do a little bit of a sort of a multimedia masking test. So what I've got on here is Tamiya's vinyl tape for curves, which I have found to be pretty good. Can be a little more aggressive in terms of stickiness than regular, just washy masking tape. So, we'll see how that goes when I pull it off. This green stuff here is my Tamiya Substitute washi, and for those of you guys that don't know, washi is W-A-S-H-I. That's rice paper tape, which is basically which is what Tamiya is, and at least some of their tapes are manufactured by this same company, which is MT, or Kamoi Kakoshi is the parent company in Japan. Anyway, this is my substitute. This is the MT substitute, or this is the actual MT. Sorry, I haven't had enough coffee this morning and I'm talking nonsense. But anyway, this is the MT washi tape. It is a bit more tacky than the Tamiya 18 millimeter and 6 millimeter width tapes, and I didn't really do anything to detack it. It's just crammed on here and burnished down, so we'll see how well the paint holds up to that when I go to peel it off. It did fine yesterday when I peeled off the Tamiya tape, so we'll see. Now over here I've used some of my masking fluid, which is still drying, and that's this stuff. It's this liquid frisket, and one of the reasons I wanted to try this is because this is very definitely an ammonia-based latex product. I mean, you can smell it when you open the bottle. It stinks to high heaven, especially when it starts going bad as it gets old. And some people have found that these ammonia-based masking fluids will have a bad effect on acrylic paints, which is not an unreasonable thing, given that ammonia is a solvent for latex. And I'm putting air quotes around the word latex because this is just one of those stupid things in the paint industry. None of these paints actually contain real latex. Latex is a derivative of natural rubber, and none of the paints you buy, not even the house paint you buy at Home Depot, has real latex in it. It's why they choose to call it that is beyond me, but whatever it is in there, it's ammonia based, and it is a solvent for stuff that is in these acrylic paints. So I just want to see if I'm going to produce any harm by using that. And this can be a real nice time saver when you're doing a wavy camouflage pattern like this, as opposed to going and filling in with all these little pieces of tape. I just took a Q-tip and just spooged on a layer of masking fluid right there in 2 seconds. So we will see what, if any, issues that produces. I've got some paint mixed up and ready to go, and I'm going to spray that right now. I mixed this. This is I wanted to get a little better contrast, so I've gone with this green one, and I mixed it 25% thinner and 25% poly. And I gotta say, man, I was wrong about these bottles right off the bat being rigid. These bottles are fantastic. They actually do squeeze easily, and John must have been listening when I made my rant last year about the perfect bottle of paint, because he's left this strip in here where you can actually see into the bottle, and you know, you can see with this bottle where I've used a bunch of the brown, you can actually tell how much is left in the damn bottle. Imagine the genius of that. So kudos to you guys, Mission Models Paints, for using some freaking common sense in designing your labels. So anyway, I'm going to load up and I'm going to paint this. And after it's dry, we'll come back and do some chipping. Okay, so here we go. I've given this about half an hour to dry, and we are about to chip it. But first, let's get rid of this masking material and see if we have any issues. And you can see I did not take any particular care to rip that tape off. And the only place I see a chip is right there. That one little speck of primer came up. So good to know. Now let's take off this area that's covered in masking fluid. And I don't really expect any problems there, but let's just get that off. Masking fluid is nice because it's quick to apply, but it can be very slow to to remove. Sometimes it comes off real easily, and sometimes it's a real hassle. Now I will say this seems to be stuck on here a little more firmly than I would usually expect from masking fluid, and I don't know, that may or may not be a result of paint composition. Who knows? Anything I said about that would be pure speculation. But I've definitely had it come off easier than it's coming off right now. And I have even damaged the paint a little bit getting it off. In fact, I just put a nail scratch on there, right there, doing that. So this is interesting. This, oh man, put a big gouge in it right there. So, look, this is interesting, and this is why I like to do these tests, because based on this experience right here, my recommendation on using masking fluid directly on this paint would be don't do it. Why did it cause that problem there where I chipped it a little bit with my fingernail where before I couldn't scratch it? I don't know. But, you know, look, if you hear hoofbeats, think horse, not zebra, certainly applies here. I couldn't scratch it before. I put masking fluid on. I can scratch it now. That leads me to believe that there is some sort of weakening effect on the paint caused by whatever is in the masking fluid. So we won't do that again. But just before we get too committed to that as science, keep in mind that there is a layer of hairspray on here. And while I wouldn't expect hairspray to affect the paint either, if we were going to be scientifically rigorous, we'd have to separate the variables and do another test. But ain't nobody got time for that right now. Let's just get to knocking some paint off and see what happens. There we go. There's the first bit of paint coming up. And look at that. It is flying off, okay? This is why I don't like to use hairspray out of the can, because look at that. That's way out of control. And I didn't pick my most aggressive brush. And you may not have noticed, but I painted this sort of in two different densities, okay? Over here, you'll notice that you can't see that black stripe underneath there, whereas over here, it's more translucent. I did that just to address the fact that different people paint in different styles. This over here is way more paint than I would normally put down, and it is already just coming way off of there. Now, look, I used a lot of water, okay? I didn't do anything to dry this brush off. I just let the water sit there, which is kind of the worst case for chipping. So let me dry my brush off a little bit and use a little less water. And let's see what happens. Definitely getting better control that way. But you can see that even with a little bit of water, that any amount of time at all for that paint to soften up is going to result in it coming loose. So for that particular chipping technique where you use a brush, then and you use strokes like that, then you know, that's precarious. Let's try this wisp brush. It's a little less aggressive. I'll take some. I took most of the water out of it. Let's see what happens. You know, and this is kind of the normal thing with chipping acrylic paints, where you get kind of lulled into this false sense of security because you're brushing and brushing and brushing and nothing is happening, and so you add some water, or you brush a little more aggressively, or you pause to get a more aggressive tool, and then the next stroke you take, you rip off half of your paint. Now, right here, I'm just now starting to get some tiny little chips showing through. That is the key to, that's the signal to step away, sir. Move on to a new area. Because you can see it, maybe, I'm starting to get a little bit of wrinkling in the paint here where the water has been sitting for longer, and you know, it isn't going to be. Yep, there we go. You know, once the water gets underneath there and really gets into that hairspray, that's when you're going to have a bad time if that's not what you want. If you're after small chips. You know, because once the water gets under the edge of that paint and really gets into that hairspray, if you have a thick layer of hairspray like I did, then things are going to get sporty in a hurry. So I'm going to go over here to this area where the paint is a lot thinner, and we'll go after that. Yep, and there we go. I've got a few little chips starting to appear. I'm working lightly here. I'm trying to be as delicate and gentle as possible. But I think you can see that, you know, look, chipping is alchemy, okay? I definitely encourage people who, well, anybody who's doing it, to test it if you're using a new paint system and work with it until you figure out what the formula is for that particular situation, because it is alchemy and you are not guaranteed to get the same results twice just because you are doing the same thing or because you think you're doing the same thing. I mean, even look right here with what I'm doing. I've got paint that's definitely thinner here, but I'm able to control the chipping even though I'm using the same brush. And I'm getting some real nice tiny chips, and that's good, because that's what I want. I always want to start with tiny chips, and I don't want big chips until I want big chips. So anyway, when you're doing your chipping, always test, but especially with water-based acrylics, all right? Because you're essentially, your chipping fluid and your color coat are both dissolved by water, which is what you're using to start the chipping. So you got to be really careful. Anyway, that's all the chipping that I'm going to do. I think we've seen basically what's up with that. If I'm going to use this paint and I'm going to do chipping with it, which is almost a guarantee, then next time I would most definitely spray my hairspray or whatever chipping fluid I use, which is for me is always going to be hairspray, with my airbrush, because I can get a much lighter layer of it on there with the airbrush than I can with just bombing it with the can. So that is sorry, I'm trying to zoom the camera back out here. Anyway, so it is what it is. That's the chipping test. Next is I'm going to let this dry, and then we're going to put a decal on it and see what happens then. Okay, let's do a decal, and let's make the stakes really high by using a Tamiya decal, because we all know that sometimes they are super uncooperative. But let's just real quick grab this one off of this sheet, and we'll take let's see, I need some tweezers here, and while this is marinating in my standard year-old decal water jar, we'll talk about a couple of things. First, here's something interesting. After I announced earlier that I was going to put the decal on, straight on the paint, as I am fond of doing, anybody who's watched my stuff knows this, it occurred to me that with this chipping fluid on here, hairspray, and it being such a thick layer and so readily activated by the chipping water, that the decal water might cause a disaster. And this would be a case where I would choose to put a clear coat on here to protect things before I did the decal if I were doing this for real. But I recognized that over here and over here I had areas where the hairspray was just laying there, and I thought, well, I'll just take a rag with some water on it and wash the hairspray off. And here's something interesting. I did that, and look at the rag, okay? And you can see that not so much here, but over here, I was clearly scrubbing through some of the paint, which isn't a huge surprise because this area right here, as you remember, is straight out of the bottle. And this over here has polyurethane in it. Now polyurethane, you know, things like Aqua Gloss and Future and so forth are clear varnishes that are designed to put a waterproof layer of plastic on your boat deck. So I wouldn't expect the water to affect this much, but over here, I've basically got a rag soaked in solvent as far as a layer of water-based paint is concerned. So just something to keep in mind. You also might recognize that there are some potential paint weathering opportunities there. So anyway, now that we've got this decal kind of ready to go, let's see if it'll come off of the paper. It should. That's probably enough soaking time. Not quite. Let's let it get a little wetter. There's no real hurry. I thought I let it soak long enough, but apparently not. And we're going to abuse this thing because that's how I run my tests. A lot of what I like to figure out is sort of the worst case scenario. So, here in a minute, when the decal is ready to cooperate, we're going to stick it straight on this paint. Okay, we should be ready now. And there we go. We'll run that decal right across those two areas of paint and take in a little bit of a panel line while we're at it. Now, first things first is I want to soak up the water, especially over here where I don't want to reactivate any chipping fluid, but come on, stay put. Get that decal nice and snuggled down. Okay. Man, that is a goofy colored decal, isn't it? I don't know what Tamiya was thinking when they elected to make that one that color of blue, but that certainly looks wrong to me. I don't hate on Tamiya decals as much as a lot of people do, but I don't think I would choose to use those for real, given that weird color of blue. Anyhow, now that we got that stuck down there enough, let's put some Solvaset on there. That's kind of the real test. I like Solvaset. It's the strongest decal setting solution that I know of, short of just using, you know, lacquer thinner or something like that. You don't always need it, but for this test, because we're doing worst case, it's what I'm going to use. So I'm going to just very liberally spooge some on there, and then I will do what you're always supposed to do after you apply Solvaset. And that is to walk away, forget about it, and don't touch it for a while. Especially once you see it starting to wrinkle, as it's already doing here, because that's what's supposed to happen and you shouldn't be scared. Okay, so it's been about an hour, and you can see that I've still got a little bit of Solvaset action happening here on this decal, so not quite ready to mess with any of that area, but while that's continuing to do its work, I want to do a quick test on this part of the primer here and do a little sanding. Now, the instructions want you to wait 48 hours before you sand it. I don't want to wait 48 hours. I want to do it in 24 because that's what I would expect from Stynylrez, and I think that should be enough. So I'm going to try and do this without banging the camera too much. Maybe what I need to do is move the camera back and zoom in. But let's just do it this way. We'll zoom manually. Okay, so I've got just this kind of worn out 320 grit sanding sponge that I often use for knocking the texture off of a paint, and it's a good place to start. And immediately I like what I'm seeing. It's got a good sanding feel to it. It's not sticky or grippy, and it's not tearing or doing anything weird like that. Tell you what, let's get a more aggressive sanding pad. Let's don't waste any time. Let's just get right to the abuse. So this is a well-worn 240 grit sponge, and if bad things are going to happen, it'll make it. This sanding sponge will bring those out in a bigger hurry. So we'll see. But again, feels good. It feels tough. I'm seeing some dust, but not a lot of dry dust. I'm actually a little surprised at how much it's kind of resisting me. Some primers are soft, and when you get after them with sandpaper, you immediately start to see some dust, and they work down to a smooth surface pretty quickly. So I'm a little surprised that this one is acting as sturdy as it is. That's not necessarily a bad thing. I'd rather have a primer that's a little hard than the other way around, for obvious reasons. So this is good. Hell, let's just go. Let's go full aggro with this sanding sponge or sanding stick. This is a 240 grit sanding stick, and there are times when that might be your tool of choice. It's a little barbaric for doing things like this, but hey, this is my usual worst case testing, and you can see that it is now gouging and scratching with that. But again, I don't think anybody should be surprised by that. That's not necessarily the tool of choice right there for sanding a primer layer. So let's go back to this one and sand out the scratches, and I've purposefully flipped it over to an area that's not as worn down, so it'll be a little more aggressive, and we'll see how that works. And what I would like to do is sand all the way through it and see if it feathers out. That's kind of the ultimate test, is once you have worked all the way through that layer of material, does it then start to flake or tear, or does it feather out and leave you with nice smooth edges? So here's what I'm seeing. It isn't feathering so much. It is kind of tearing there along the edges, but it is getting really thin before it does that. So in looking at it with my Optivisor, I don't think that those edges are going to show under another layer of paint. If we were going to go back over this with the if we were going to go straight to the color coat, then the fear would be that if you had tears from your sanding, that those little microscopic edges that might not show or seem so bad when you're just looking at them like this suddenly become little features in your color coat. And I don't know that's going to be a problem with this, because it is getting pretty thin there before it starts to exhibit that behavior. So again, it's not feathering out the way that a lacquer primer would, but part of the reason that a lacquer primer does that is because it's essentially soaked into the surface of the plastic. And no acrylic primer does that. It's just chemically impossible. Badger's primer does do a fairly decent job of feathering, and I consider it to be the benchmark for acrylic primers, but even it does not feather out as perfectly as an old school lacquer primer does. So I would call this test a success. I've managed to smooth this down pretty well. You can kind of hear it starting to squeak now, which means that particular grit of sandpaper is no longer doing much work for us, and that minimal texture that was on there is gone. So that's good. I would call that successful. Okay, let's add one more quick quirk to this sanding test. I've got a piece of 1000 grit wet or dry here, and I'm going to make it wet. With a lacquer primer, I wouldn't expect any problems with wet sanding. For obvious reasons, I don't have the same level of confidence with an acrylic primer, but let's check it out. Let's see what happens. So far, so good. I mean, I can't feel it causing any problems. And that's always good. I mean, if there's going to be a problem with wet sanding, you're going to know it almost immediately. I did manage to sand through the primer a little bit in a couple of spots there, but that's not a fault with the primer. I mean, that's just the fact that I was doing a bunch of sanding. So I would say, again, that's a pretty favorable result for the sanding the primer test. Okay, this thing is all dried out now. Decal has pretty well shrunken itself into place, and I think we can safely move on. And I'm just taking a close look at this in my Optivisor, and I think you guys can probably see this too. The decal has nestled itself down pretty well, but there are some problems. You can see right there on the lower right side of that star that it's all wrinkled up. And some on the left side there too. And some people might immediately say, oh no, you've had a reaction with your Salva set. This honestly is something that I've never seen before. And so some people might say, oh, well, that's because of the paint. And I would say, no, not so fast. There's no way to know that. Remember, I have a heavy layer of hairspray under this. And I don't know that I got it all off when I wiped it off over here in this tan area. And this, I'm actually kind of glad this happened, because this is one of those things that I see a lot in the conversations online about paint and guys talking about problems that they've had with their paint. And the conversation is kind of always pretty similar. I don't know what I did wrong. This paint normally works good, and then everybody else is chiming in. I've never had any problem with that paint, blah, blah, blah. But what gets lost in all these conversations is all of these weird things that we are doing to our paint in the name of weathering. We're adding a lot of stuff in between layers and on top of layers, like hairspray, chipping fluid, enamel weathering products, various clear coats, all that sort of stuff. And that sort of complicates the experiment. That introduces variables that may or may not be having an effect on things. And so I'm just always, kind of, I try to keep things as simple as possible. And whenever somebody does have these problems and these conversations are going on, I always ask, so did you do this? Have you, what's going on here, to try to really understand what all the variables are. Anyway, I'm just kind of rambling a little bit, but I feel like that kind of highlights an important issue. And what I'm doing now is what I would do under these circumstances, should this have happened, on a real project. And also, remember, I've got a few little bits of texture here and there that I still don't like. And so this is what I would be doing under those circumstances. I'm never afraid to go after a problem with sandpaper, because not only does it solve the immediate problem, but sometimes when I'm doing a project where I want a certain level of paint wear, I find that sandpaper is a great way to introduce some abrasions and variations that are real random. And you can even see that some of that's happening now, where I'm getting a little bit of breakthrough in the paint there, and that looks cool. Looks like worn paint. Is it going to solve this problem with the cracked decal here? Probably not, but not something that I really have to care about in this experiment. It wouldn't be horrible. I mean, look, these things happen in real life. But anyway, the point is that I am sanding down a couple of things, and one of them is right here. Remember when I left the Solva set sitting on here, I said never touch the decal, and that's true. You don't want to, and I didn't. But what I did do is I had a couple of little puddles of Solva set around here that I thought, well, I should sop those up to keep them from soaking through the paint into that hairspray and causing a problem. And this was within like a minute after I had put it on. And right here, I touched with the Q-tip, and immediately it lifted that paint off of there. Now, again, I don't think that's something that happened between the paint and the Solva set. I think that's something that happened because of the hairspray underneath the paint, because the Solva set didn't affect the paint anywhere else. And John and I have talked about it too, and he has not found any issues between Solva set and this paint, and I wouldn't expect there to be any. So at any rate, I'm just making sure it's all smooth, because that's the kind of thing that I would be doing under these circumstances before going on to the next step, which is to get after it a little bit with some enamel weathering products. And I'm gonna see if I can get over here and grab them without disturbing the camera. And I'm going to keep this simple. I'm not going to go through a bunch of oil paint rendering and so forth, because really all we need to do is show that mineral spirits will not mess with this stuff. And again, this fits in with my normal strategy, which is to do this weathering directly on the paint, which not everybody likes to do. It all depends on the effect that you're after. So if you at this point, or even prior to this point, would have put a coat of something like all clad aqua gloss, for example, on here as an acrylic clear varnish, then you wouldn't have anything to worry about. But again, want to reiterate something, going back to the hairspray, because I've had this happen, especially with a water-based clear coat like Aqua Gloss. You lay that on there and it sits there and it actually soaks into the paint enough that it reactivates that hairspray, and then you may have a disaster on your hands because now you've got that Aqua Gloss and that paint sitting on top of what's basically a soft fluid layer of hairspray, and your paint may start wrinkling or sagging. So again, when you're introducing all these various layers of things in here, you can run into problems that you might not anticipate. And that's one reason why when I put a clear coat on this later as the last part of this test, it's not going to be Aqua Gloss. It's going to be Tamiya X22A. Not X22A, sorry, I was thinking of X20A. But I'm also going to do that because I like to, like a lot of guys, if I use X20, I like to thin it with Mr. Color, Mr. Leveling thinner. Because that just makes such a beautiful gloss clear. And I want to know if, because Mr. Color, Mr. Leveling Thinner is a lacquer product, if that's going to have any effect on this paint. So you can see that I am just happily splooging this Tamiya Panaline accent color all over the place here. Again, not necessarily the way I would do it normally, but I want to get a whole bunch of mineral spirits piled up onto this this test piece and make sure that that's not going to cause a problem. So we'll come back to this later after this is all dry. So here we go. I am back and getting ready to take off the excess Panaline wash here. So what I'm going to do to make it quick and easy is just get a little bit of mineral spirits on this rag. Don't want too much. Shouldn't need too much. And I'm just gonna try and get this done quick and easy. See, I already got too much because I just immediately pulled it all out of my panel lines. But I'm not really trying to get a perfect panel line wash here as much as I am trying to just make sure that mineral spirits will not in any way harm the paint, which I wouldn't expect it to. I mean, really, pretty much any acrylic paint should be basically impervious to mineral spirits. It shouldn't be something you have to worry about. So nothing much to see here or say about that. That's exactly what I would have expected, is for that to turn out okay. So let that dry off, and then it'll be time for a clear coat, and we'll be about done, finally. Alright, so I'm going to mix up just a little bit of Tamiya X22 clear gloss. Whoops. If I can keep from making a mess while I'm doing it. It's the great thing about clear, right? If you spill it on yourself, no one knows. Anyhow, I'm cutting it with Mr. Leveling Thinner, as you can see here. 50-50. That seems to be pretty much the magic mix. And again, I'm doing that because this is a really good blend for a utility gloss, and while I would not expect any issue with the lacquer thinner, this is just part of the test to make sure. So I'm gonna stir that up and spray it, and we'll come back. All right, so this clear coat is dry and doesn't look too bad. You can really see any defects though when you start to get things shiny, and you can see I've got a little bit of texture in that decal. This decal just seems determined not to be very cooperative, which is kind of weird because I put this one on in just as a part of an experiment that I did, and same deal, same decal sheet right on the paint, Tamiya XF2 in this case, and it put on the same way and behaved perfectly. The real reason I had this out though is because I wanted to show you guys this. This is a little testing that I was doing with trying to spray real tiny with my Badger Sotar. And this is Mr. Paint straight out of the bottle. So the only reason I'm just showing you this is to kind of give you a frame of reference for what I sort of consider to be the kind of the benchmark for the best that you can do in creating a marbling texture in painting small lines. And you can see just how tight that is with a lacquer, being there's no overspray or softness to those. And I am going to try and shoot some of this Mission Models stuff with my Sotar tomorrow. But before I do that, I'm going to sand a little bit on this clear coat just because I'm compelled to. And then I'm going to shoot some dull coat on it, and we'll get a last look at it before we wrap this up. Okay, gangsters, day 3 of the Mission Models paint test, and thank goodness it is almost over. Now, I don't say that because it's been bad. In fact, it's been good, and it's been a lot of fun. But it's going to be a shit ton of video editing, and I'm not looking forward to that. But so be it. Anyhow, last thing I did to the little paint mule here was shoot a layer of ungloss on it. And in this case, I just used my handy dandy Testors dull coat in the rattle can. And that is not the thing I would normally do for the final finish on anything like this. But it's quick and easy. And, I just wanted everybody to be able to see what this thing looks like in its proper flattened condition. And, I think you have to agree it looks pretty nice. Not a bad looking wing, especially, considering the way that I got there. So I think that pretty much concludes the basic and most important parts of the test for Mission Models paint. I think I've done everything that I would normally do, and I think that most of us would normally do in the course of using it. Now, time for a little bit of curiosity testing. John, wants everybody to use his thinner, which is understandable. But I hope he also understands that model makers are a naturally curious bunch, and it's 100% inevitable that we're going to want to know if other thinners can be used. So I've got 3 cups here to add to my growing pile, where I've put 20 drops of the green in it that I was using already, and I've got some X20A, and we're going to thin at the same prescribed ratios using 3 different thinners. So here we go. All right, so I've been using 25% thinner, so that'll be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 drops of X20A in the first cup there, and it didn't explode yet, so and I really would have not expected any issue. Okay, now I've got Ultimate Airbrush Thinner, and this will be useful for those guys as well, because their claim with this thinner is that it works with every acrylic paint out there, and so far I haven't seen anything that suggests that they're wrong. This is a good alcohol blend airbrush thinner. So let's go. Oops, that was 3, 4, 5. Wow. 5 drops right there in a hurry. So that's good. Again, no fires or other disasters. Now, here's where we're going to get really stupid. I'm sure John will cringe at this, but I have to do it because I know I'm going to be asked. Here we go. Mr. Color Leveling Thinner, which is lacquer, obviously, but it is magic juice for many paints. Tamiya, Mr. Hobby, and any regular old school lacquer as well. So this will be interesting. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There we go. And what immediately happens with lacquer thinner in paints like Vallejo that have a vinyl component, as I understand it, is that they just start to curdle immediately and just turn into a terrible disaster. So the fact that that has not happened in this cup right here, may be a good sign. I don't know. I'm going to stir it up here before we make any conclusions, because I honestly don't expect it to work. But then there have been other things with this paint that have gone better than expected. So, who knows? All right, so first, X20A, stirring it up. No issues, and there shouldn't be. Okay, UMP, stirring it up. No issues. And it seems to be the same consistency as the other stuff. Now, since we're now not really doing alcohol, although most lacquer thinners include some of the same alcohols, let's stir this one up and see what we have. Again, no issue. I don't see any anyway. No visible issue. Seems to be the same consistency. Now, we don't know how it would spray or how, you know, it would dry, rather, and what kind of properties it would have. But just based on that right there, I would say that the answer to can you thin Mission Models paint with Mr. Color Leveling Thinner is yes, you can. It is definitely, you know, it definitely looks a little different in the cup there. You can see that there's a little bit of, you know, kind of the way that it behaves when it flows around is a little bit different. Now, does that mean that it's a problem? I don't know. what I'll probably do is spray some of this out and see what happens. But really, again, doesn't look at first blush to be any different than thinning it with an alcohol blend. But we're about to complicate things by adding the poly, and that's where any one of these could go south, because the polyurethane component will, it may not work well. In particular with the lacquer. Anybody who's ever made the mistake of trying to clean something like All Clad Aqua Gloss out of an airbrush with lacquer thinner knows what I'm talking about. It turns into a gummy mess immediately. And that's a polyurethane clear, which, has this sort of similar milky appearance to Aqua Gloss. So anyway, let's just find out. I'm going to put in 25%. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And we'll stir that up and see what happens. Sorry guys, I know this is not exciting, but I think these are interesting things to look into. Now, the thing with the poly that you might notice, I don't know if you'll be able to tell really here, is that it does actually thicken the paint back up a little bit. I mean, that's not a surprise. I mean, when you look at it coming out of the bottle, it's obviously a thicker material, but it does help it flow a little bit better for whatever reason. So that in and of itself is not necessarily a bad thing. So here we go. Let's see if this will stir up or if it just becomes a mess. Okay, so it's stirring, but if you look down in the bottom of the cup, there are some weird little globules forming down there in the bottom that we did not have before, and I suspect that is something happening between some component of the lacquer thinner and the polyurethane. I mean, it has to be. So that doesn't look super promising, but we've shown that you can spray this stuff pretty effectively without the poly. So that's always an option. I don't see any of those little globules in either of the other two materials. So good. So here's my conclusion at this point with this little experiment in thinning is without the poly, you can use X20A, UMP, or Mr. Color Leveling Thinner. With the poly, it's the same, but it's not looking too good on the Mr. Color Leveling Thinner. Again, those little nodules scare me. Now, when I spray it, I may find that they are irrelevant. So I'm now compelled to go off camera and do exactly that. So last little bit of curiosity testing is done. The first thing I did was I took the paint that I had mixed with Mr. Leveling Thinner and sprayed that using the same airbrush that I've been using for the rest of the test, and it's sprayed fine. It looks great. You can see I did do some small spraying there. Obviously, I had a little blowout there, so it didn't go perfectly, but it did pretty well. And that is with an airbrush that has been declining in performance over the course of this test. It's just been getting filthy, which is what I would expect from a consistent use of an acrylic. Now, here's where the test just failed. Okay, did you see that? While I was talking, I scratched that with my thumbnail and came right off. And it appears to even have softened the primer underneath. So we can't call that a success. That's good, because while it may have looked good, obviously it produced a problem that is unacceptable. Now, by tomorrow with some cure time, maybe this will be fine. I don't know. I'll scratch it again then and find out. But this right here is enough to convince me that thinning this stuff with Mr. Leveling Thinner when it's mixed with the poly is not a good idea. I may go back and try it just straight out of the bottle with Mr. Leveling Thinner and see what happens there. But this obviously was not a successful test. And this was about 3 layers thick right here. This down here where I sprayed more lightly is not as rubbery, which kind of makes sense. So, but anyway, there we go. That's that little bit of nonsense. The other thing I wanted to do to push it was to spray a little bit with my Sotar, and so I just took this paint that was mixed with the UMP alcohol thinner and put some in my Sotar. Now, this is where it's going to be pretty unimpressive for a lot of you guys, and understandably so. You can see here that it was wildly uncontrollable. I mean, I did spray some pretty tight lines, but not with any consistency or control, and I had a bunch of blowouts. And honestly, I'm not surprised, because the thing you have to know about the Sotar is this is an airbrush designed for illustrators spraying inks. And so it's got a 0.15 millimeter needle, and part of the reason why I did this off camera is because I also really suck with a double action airbrush. Even with this tall trigger on here, the whole motion of push down, pull back while I'm making it look easy right here is very difficult for me to do when I'm actually, holding the airbrush in the proper grip and trying to control it in a specific way. So, but the point is that when I do it, well, let me also say that one of the interesting features about a Sotar is that you won't find on any other airbrush, not made by Badger anyway, is that you can use the needle stop to preset the needle to an open position. Basically, when you unscrew the needle stop far enough, it starts pushing against this ball on the end of the needle and basically retards it. It backs it out a little bit. So I've got this one retarded just enough so that if I've got Mr. Paint in here, and that's what I did here, all I have to do is press the button down to draw air, and it immediately starts spraying these skinny little lines. And that's great for me because I don't have to worry about controlling the trigger draw in order to consistently pull the right amount of air to maintain those tight lines. And part of the reason that it works with Mr. Paint is because it just pretty much never gets any tip dry. Now, with this stuff, I got immediate tip dry. I got quite a bit of buildup on the tip, and that's part of why it was just so uncontrollable, and it wouldn't spray those tight lines consistently. Now, what this highlights is that not all materials work equally in all airbrushes. And so your mileage may vary, and you just have to accept that. So this paint may not work very well for you if you're expecting to spray super tight patterns out of an Iwata Micron. Maybe it will, I don't know. I've never used one, but it has a very small needle just like this one does. I mean, look, I've sprayed tight modeling patterns on German camo out of my Iwata HPTH, which has a 0.5 millimeter needle in it that basically is just chopped off blunt at the business end of it. So you can't necessarily gauge what you can do with an airbrush based on the needle and nozzle size, because there is, going to be some variability according to the type of paint you're using. So again, I'm just throwing this in there at the tail end of this test so that you guys can kind of get an idea, of how this stuff performs with different equipment. The fact is that this is a paint system that you're going to have to dial in to find the sweet spot based on your own equipment and your own painting style. Okay guys, so there you go. That is what hopefully John will agree and you guys will agree is a thorough look at the new paint line from Mission Models. I want to get right to my conclusions because this has already gone on for so long and I don't want to waste any more of your time. Here's kind of in a nutshell what my conclusions are. I would say that for all practical purposes, this paint is 80 to 90% as good as a lacquer. Now, obviously I'm a fan of lacquer paints, and so there may be some bias in that. I also recognize that not everybody enjoys lacquers because of the toxicity and whatnot. And so, John may very well make up that 10 or 20% with those guys who are looking to avoid the issues with a lacquer. If I had to sort of line this paint up with other paints that I've used in comparison, where things like Vallejo are way over here on the left, which is the not good end, and way over here on the right are things like Mr. Paint, which I think are absolutely wonderful. And Tamiya, I put, again, at about that 90% point next to Mr. Paint. And Tamiya is a special case because you can use it either as an acrylic or as a lacquer, depending on how you reduce it. And here's what I would say regarding Mission Models paint. If I gave you 2 cups full of paint in a blind taste test and asked you to spray them and judge the results, I don't think you'd be able to tell the difference between Mission Models paint and Tamiya thinned with X20A. I think that they perform about equally in that respect. And I have to say that that is far better than I would have expected from an acrylic that's billed as a water-based material, because Vallejo and some of those others are way over there on the left end in that group, which I've just not been a fan of. But Mission Models paints don't have those additives that Vallejo does that make them rubbery and snotty and do weird things when you try to squirt it out of the little bottle. So there's a lot to like about these paints. John is an enthusiastic guy who's dedicated to bringing a good product to market, as he's demonstrated with all of the phone calls and text messages he and I have shared over the course of this test. But that alone would not make me give him a good grade. If his paint sucked, I would say so. But it does not suck. I think it's pretty good stuff. I think it's pretty compelling, especially if you're one of those folks out there who's looking for a paint that is, safer, so to speak, than anything else. And at about $6 a bottle, I think that it's real reasonably priced. So if you can get next to, having to mix it and be a little more disciplined than you would otherwise have to, and you're looking for water-based, and you're like me, you're looking for the perfect little squeeze bottle. I swear I'm going to text John and ask him where I can get some of these. Then Mission Models paint is definitely something that I think you should take a look at. I like it. It's good stuff. And if I were not already a pretty dedicated lacquer and Tamiya user, I could see myself, using this on a lot of projects, and I may yet. We'll just have to see. But there you go. That's my conclusion. And if you set through all of this, I really appreciate it, and always much love.